Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and let's wrap up week 15 with Silmarillion Saturday. Now, these Saturdays are our chance to revisit the history and legends of the Elder Days, sometimes from the Silmarillion, sometimes the Unfinished Tales, sometimes more. Now, over the last 2 weeks, we spent time diving deep into the story of the Druidine, the unique people who we meet in The Lord of the Rings as the Woses, led by Khan Barry-Khan. We even got to read The Faithful Stone, which is one of my favorite stories in Middle-earth. This week and next, though, we're going to shift gears, and we are going to read about the coming of men into the West. When 300 years and more were gone since the Noldor came to Beleriand, in the days of the Long Peace, Finrod Felagund, Lord of Nargothrond, journeyed east of Sirion and went hunting with Maglor and Maedhros, sons of Feanor. But he wearied of the chase, and passed on alone towards the mountains of Ered Lindon that he saw shining afar. And, taking the dwarf road, he crossed Gelion at the ford of Sarn Athrad, and turning south over the upper streams of Asgard, he came into the north of Osiriand. In a valley among the foothills of the mountains, below the springs of Thalos, he saw lights in the evening, and far off he heard the sound of song. At this he wondered much, for the green elves of that land lit no fires, nor did they sing by night. At first he feared that a raid of orcs had passed the leaguer of the north, but as he drew near, he perceived that it was not so, for the singers used a tongue that he had not heard before, neither that of dwarves nor of orcs. Then Felagund, standing silent in the night shadow of the trees, looked down into the camp, and there he beheld a strange people. Now these were a part of the kindred and following of Beor the Old, as he was afterwards called, a chieftain among men. After many lives of wandering out of the east, he had led them at last over the Blue Mountains, the first of the race of men to enter Beleriand. And they sang because they were glad, and believed that they had escaped from all perils, and had come at last to a land without fear. Long Felagund watched them, and love for them stirred in his heart, but he remained hidden in the trees until they had all fallen asleep. Then he went among the sleeping people, and sat beside their dying fire where none kept watch. And he took up a rude harp which Beor had laid aside, and he played music upon it, such as the ears of men had not heard, for they had as yet no teachers in the art, save only the dark elves in the wild lands. Now men awoke and listened to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream, until he saw that his fellows were awake also beside him. But they did not speak or stir while Felagund still played, because of the beauty of the music and the wonder of the song. Wisdom was in the words of the elven king, and the hearts grew wiser that hearkened to him, for the things of which he sang, of the making of Arda and the bliss of Aman beyond the shadows of the sea, came as clear visions before their eyes, and his elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. Thus it was that men called King Felagund, whom they first met of all the Eldar, Gnome, that is, wisdom, in the language of that people. And after him they named his folk Gnomen, the wise. Indeed, they believed at first that Felagund was one of the Valar, of whom they had heard rumor that they dwelt far in the west, and this was, some say, the cause of their journeying. But Felagund dwelt among them and taught them true knowledge, and they loved him, and took him for their lord, and were ever after loyal to the house of Finarfin. Now the Eldar were beyond all other peoples skilled in tongues, and Felagund discovered also that he could read in the minds of men such thoughts as they wished to reveal in speech, so that their words were easily interpreted. It is said also that these men had long had dealings with the dark elves east of the mountains, and from them had learned much of their speech. And since all the languages of the Quendi were of one origin, the language of Beor and his folk resembled the elven tongue in many words and devices. It was not long, therefore, before Felagund could hold converse with Beor, and while he dwelt with him, they spoke much together. But when he questioned him concerning the arising of men and their journeys, Beor would say little, and indeed he knew little, for the fathers of his people had told few tales of their past, and a silence had fallen upon their memory. "A darkness lies behind us," Beor said, "and we have turned our backs upon it, and we do not desire to return thither even in thought. Westwards our hearts have been turned, and we believe that there we shall find light." But it was said afterwards among the Eldar that when men awoke in Hildorian at the rising of the sun, the spies of Morgoth were watchful, and tidings were soon brought to him, and this seemed to him so great a matter that secretly under shadow he himself departed from Angband and went forth into Middle-earth, leaving to Sauron the command of the war. Of his dealings with men the Eldar indeed knew nothing at that time, and learnt but little afterwards, but that a darkness lay upon the hearts of men, as the shadow of the kinslaying and the doom of Mandos lay upon the Noldor. They perceived clearly even in the people of the elf friends whom they first knew. To corrupt or destroy whatsoever arose new and fair was ever the chief desire of Morgoth. And doubtless he had this purpose also in his errand, by fear and lies to make men the foes of the Eldar, and bring them up out of the east against Beleriand. But this design was slow to ripen, and was never wholly achieved. For men, it is said, were at first very few in number, or as Morgoth grew afraid of the growing power and union of the Eldar, and came back to Angband, leaving behind at that time but few servants, and those of less might and cunning. I have long loved this chapter, especially Finrod's discovery of men at the beginning. I'm sure, we joke about the rude harp all the time. Hey, man, put me down. Out of my way. I'm harping here. But, this is truly a magical moment, making fun of it, jokes or whatever. It's really a Farian moment, right? The men are transported in a way to the very edge of Fairy itself when Finrod plays. Then we get our first glimpse of Osanwe, that ability to read minds and communicate telepathically as well, although it's not called that here. Then we have that brief but dark glimpse at man's early days, something I think we might get into during a series of Patreon premium episodes when I dive into the Athrabeth. And finally, the hints of Morgoth's evil design behind the scenes, slow to ripen. We'll see more of his handiwork next week, but that does wrap it up today for Silmarillion Saturday. Come back for more of the Elder Days every Saturday as we open up the pages of Middle-earth history. And if there is a first or second age story you'd like to hear me read and discuss, please let me know by emailing bartleman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show and get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a lot more. Finally, join me again next Monday as we start the last week of this second series, week 16 of today's Tolkien Times with Mailbag Monday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.